You are listening to KZSC's Voces, Críticas, Critical Voices. I am your producer and host, Silvana Falcón. Today I'm here with Dr. Macarena Gómez-Barris, Chair of the Department of Social Science and Cultural Studies and Director of the Global South Center at the Pratt Institute in New York. She writes and teaches on social and cultural theory, decolonial thought, racial and extractive capitalism, social movements, queer and submerged perspectives, critical Indigenous studies, experimental film, and social environmental transformation. Dr. Gómez-Barris is the author of 3 books, including Beyond the Pink Tide, Art and Political Undercurrents in the Americas, published this year by the University of California Press, The Extractive Zone, Social Ecologies and Decolonial Perspectives, published in 2017 by Duke University Press, and Where Memory Dwells, Culture and State Violence in Chile, published in 2009 by UC Press. She's also the co-editor with Dr. Herman Gray, our own UC Santa Cruz sociology professor, of a book called Towards a Sociology of a Trace. University of Minnesota Press published this book in 2010. She's now working on a new book project called Sea Edges, Military Capitalism, Extinction, and Decolonial Futures. I've invited her to talk about her research, specifically the aspects focused on Indigenous struggles. Welcome, Macarena, to KZSC's Voces Críticas.
Well, thank you, Silvana, for having me. It's really an honor to be here with you and to have this conversation. And I just feel kindred spirit with you in terms of being able to do this work and disseminate ideas within the university, but also outside of it.
Your work has covered such a wide range of topics when it comes to struggles affecting the Americas. I want to know, how did you move from your previous work on torture and disappearances at the time of the Chilean dictatorship to the extractive projects and indigeneity issues you explore today?
My first book was called Where Memory Dwells, Culture and State Violence in Chile, and that work really was about questions of representation in the aftermath of dictatorship, and it was a work that had a certain personal project for me, as my mother was forced out of Chile right after Augusto Pinochet came to power. My mother was an Allende supporter and very much part of this collective utopic project in the 1970s. And so for me, it was very important to do research on the question of collective violence and its aftermath and questions of trauma and the kind of legacies of socialism and its afterlives. That project was very dear to my heart, but it also was bound within a nation-state framework. And it was, in many ways, looking back, had its limitations in the sense that while I critiqued liberal human rights regimes, I wasn't able to get deeper into the buried histories of colonialism. And they did keep popping up in my dissertation research, and they popped up through a small book on Mapuche, Pehuenche, Huiliche, Dreams and Cosmologies as a scape for understanding trauma. They popped up through one particular image of 19th century genocide and the aftermath of women and children sitting huddled together, trying to deal with what it meant to survive the reductions or the forced movement onto reservations by the military state at that time. And these kinds of moments, while I couldn't write them in, I could only gesture to them minimally in that project. I also think I wasn't skilled enough to handle the kind of deeper arc of coloniality. They continued to haunt me, those images, those books, the kind of testimonials and stories I would hear from Mapuche peoples themselves about what they suffered, not only during dictatorship, since Mapuche peoples were definitely targeted as subversives, but the longer arc of subversion and what that meant to be a kind of anti-colonial force. So that's how I moved. There are obvious connections, but really it was about the absences and the hauntings.
So given your previous research about the Chilean dictatorship, what was your reaction to the appointment by the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres of Michelle Bachelet as the next United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights? For those who don't know, Bachelet is the former president of Chile and someone who had been tortured herself during the Pinochet dictatorship.
Yes, there's a lot in the dominant media that circulates about Bachelet as a kind of disappointing figure, that she didn't fulfill a lot of the campaign promises, or that she is an elite figure, or that she somehow represents the inability of Latin America to get its human rights record together. And of course, this comes from some right-wing sources and also conservative attacks on trying to suggest that Latin America is more of a violator, say, than the United States. So we know the falsities about some of those rhetorics. And certainly Bachelet has had her limitations, but I think it's very interesting news. It's good news in many ways, as someone herself with her mother, of course, was, tortured, imprisoned, suffered what many people in South America and Latin America and Central America, even in the United States, Guantanamo Bay prison system, have suffered in terms of torture. Michelle Bachelet can be a kind of moral voice in the way that potentially John McCain was, but of course from a transnational perspective, in the sense that she had experienced torture herself. That's important, it seems to me, in this moment when even 5-10 years ago, there's questions about whether waterboarding can continue. There's questions about using torture in relationship to war. So I think she'll remind people of the important progress that's been made, and also speak from that powerful testimonial voice that seems to find currency within a U.S. national public and within Europe.
In your work, you address the expansion of coloniality in Indigenous territories in the Americas through these extractive projects that rely on a state-corporate collaboration. Can you discuss how extractive projects reflect the colonial logics you explore?
If we go back far enough, 1492 marks not only the beginning of colonial capitalism, but it marks the beginning of extractive and racial capitalism. And, obviously Cedric Robinson in Black Marxism and other authors dig even deeper into history to kind of suggest that there's pre-Americas kind of formations that were set in motion for racial capitalism. And that's true. But I think in the Americas, to work with, roughly the 15th century, and depending on the region and space, becomes really important. And from the get-go, the project of disappearing Indigenous peoples was central to colonial settlement, whether it was in franchise settlement from afar in relationship to Spanish and Portuguese and Dutch and French powers, or if it was in relationship to settler colonialism, the kind of legal structures that were put in place to organize the new settlement societies. So Indigenous territories, cosmologies, ways of being, ways of organizing communal life in spaces, whether they be spaces of transit or settlements, became part of the logics of the genocidal project of colonialism. And I try to track that in the book in a couple of specific moments, and I try to tell that story regionally rather than for all of Latin America. But of course, this is what the great writers have been saying for a long time. I start out with the idea from Eduardo Galeano of the open veins of Latin America. Latin America, because of its rich resources and biodiversity and majority indigenous population, of course, has been the source of extraction for colonial capitalism in terms of silver mining, in terms of the rich oil resources found in Trinidad very early on, the first ongoing oil well for petrol dependency, that took place in the 1800s. So there are these periods and these moments and these sites throughout Latin America where certainly colonialism had to rule over land and territory that was of Indigenous people in order to be able to make it inroads. And that's central. I'm not for sure the first person to address this connection, but I think it is important to show how over a capitalist accumulative set of regimes, you can see these colonial logics at work. And they occur materially in the transport of goods, peoples, enslavement in relationship to Afro-descended peoples and the Afro-diaspora, of course, across the transatlantic. It refers to Indigenous violence, but even projects like state incorporation of Indigenous peoples and land through logics of mestizaje and incorporation of mestizo and mestiza, Mesti-X peoples throughout kind of state policy and state regimes. There's still a colonial logic at work. And so what a lot of decolonial scholars today, what we try to suggest is that colonialism hasn't ended just because modernity came in the Americas. In fact, the overlapping processes and coloniality persist. It operates differently depending on place, and I make a lot of that in the book, The Extractive Zone, but certainly there's a persistence at work in coloniality that is reflected back in this new phase of capital accumulation and land grabs.
You use the term extractive zones in your work. Can you explain what this term means to you and how it's been useful for your research involving activists, intellectuals, and artists?
Extractive zone is not a term that I came across, but it did come to mean a lot of different things to me. And I actually have titled the book The Extractive Zone. We could think about it as global extractive zones, because certainly some of the dynamics and forms of oppression, repression, and power structures that I try to identify as part of a neoliberal framework and an ongoing set of colonial conditions today certainly can be applied, I think, to other locations. So for me, I think the term I was trying to do a couple of things with. There's a way in which, on the one hand, I find myself dissatisfied with certain kinds of readings or certain kinds of analysis of power that totalize it, that suggests that power and the economic rationale is operative in spaces of biodiversity and indigenous territories, even in Black and Brown communities in the global North. There's a kind of totalizing understanding of the colonial matrix, as if there's no space for something else. On the other hand, I didn't want to overstate the possibilities for not only resistance, but to see a way out. So for me, I really try to create conceptual language in the book through a number of different concepts, through the concept extractive zone, but also the concept of submerged perspectives, of trying to name the aesthetic and activist trans-coalitional politics and the formations I was seeing unfolding in my field research, in my conversations and collaborations with activists, intellectuals, and artists, and really trying to find a supple enough language, conceptual language, to do the work of naming the complexity of power today, in the past, in the future. So I use that kind of temporality of past future quite a bit, but also to offer something back about strategies of resistance and refusal. It is not a complete project. There is a lot of survival, but I did want to suggest the violence and the catastrophic results of what it means to live in and with extractive and racial capitalism.
You are listening to Dr. Macarena Gómez-Barris, Chair of the Department of Social Science and Cultural Studies and Director of the Global South Center at the Pratt Institute in New York. She writes and teaches on social and cultural theory, decolonial thought, racial and extractive capitalism, critical Indigenous studies, and more. The organization Global Witness has documented that hundreds of environmental activists throughout the world, most of whom are Indigenous, are being assassinated in record numbers. We have numerous cases right here in the Americas. What is happening in your view? Why are so many of these cases unsolved, mishandled, or ignored?
Part of it is that land and water defenders, who are mostly Indigenous and, of course, allies, are at the forefront of the extractivism that's happening in the acute intensification of militarization in these racialized geographies. So on the one hand, you do have Indigenous leaders who are at the forefront, certainly more acutely now, with Standing Rock, with what happened to the Lenca activist Berta Cáceres in Honduras, to the many high-profile and less high-profile cases that are happening throughout the Americas. Certainly young people, women, LGBTQ folks, because they've been invisible and are kind of seen intersections, but definitely, of course, Indigenous leaders who are denouncing the collusion and cooperation between the state and corporations. And sometimes they are, as they are in Ecuador and Bolivia, the one and the same, because, of course, there's national industries there. So one of the things I think is important to say is that ecocide, or environmental killings of activisms, alongside the other definition of ecocide, which is killing of the non-human world or the natural world, I think that becomes really important to name. So I think there is some work being done there by really important groups to kind of make visible the activity there. But there has been a shift. If you look at Global Witness and you look at the kind of demographics, Asia and Latin America have increased number of cases of anti-extractive activists who have been killed, and land defenders, water defenders, and Indigenous peoples. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. I think that, again, there are ways in which there are spaces that the state has not been fully able to colonize, and in a moment of intensification, again, of the global capitalist economy, we're really seeing the seeking out of resources by technology and militaries and, really trying to kind of squeeze the profit in a lot of ways. And I think what they're finding in terms of hydroelectric sources, in terms of underground resources, is really people's bodies are being put in the way. On the other hand, I think that there's an ever-widening network of criminalization that's happening, and I talk about that a little bit in, Beyond the Pink Tide, the way in which the state and the media criminalize an ever-widening groups of people in order to be able to extract resources from territories. It is true that we are seeing a rise in violence quantitatively, but it's also true that there's more kind of connection between alternative media and grassroots sources that can name that violence. The last thing I'll say on this is that I think it's really important for us to not only name something like genocide, against Indigenous peoples and the historical arc of that, and ecocide, as I just talked about in relationship to killing of activists who are land and water defenders and land and water killings. And the other component is a very large increase, as you know, Silvana, in feminicide. And these three kind of forms of murder are working together because there's a basic devaluing of certain forms of social life. That's a long-winded way of saying that you're onto something by, suggesting we have to look more closely at this.
How do you make sense of this quandary that so many Indigenous communities are finding themselves in? They're either in this context of resistance and the decolonial resistance and coming up against these extractivist industries and transnational state machinery. And then they are also on the receiving end of what would be seen as sort of a more gentle kind of industry, which is the tourism industry. This industry really seeks to appropriate spirituality and spiritual practices. How do you make sense of this quandary?
I think the Mapuche case is interesting in that it, in some ways, breaks that binary because there was a moment where Mapuche poetry, in part through the work of Cecilia Vicuña and other activisms and other literary circuits that emerged, there was this moment where poetry had another route out, that is, culture and cultural formats and forms of representing communities allowed us, this other place outside of these binaries. There's a lot to say about that because one could say, well, we'll take the exceptional Mapuche subject and their incredible poetry, but we won't give land rights to Mapuche peoples themselves. In the book, I really struggle with a lot of these questions and try to suggest that spiritual tourism or New Age tourism has happened so much in the high Andes and near Cusco, near the Sacred Valley, and of course throughout Andean region. And Guatemala has this to a certain extent in other spaces throughout Latin America and certainly Africa and Asia. But this idea, right, that you can take knowledge and wisdom from the pure, untainted other come from spaces of exhaustion like the global north or the city, and then learn and then take back, this knowledge and a different view of the planetary and of each other and put it to good use and fold back in so that you too are doing your retreats, And I think there's a false kind of equation around this. I come down pretty hard on the spiritual tourist industry in the book, and then I let, to a certain degree, certain forms of ecotourism, not off the hook, but the spaces I study, I actually suggest that ecological tourism can provide some alternatives, and I actually have seen it function well in a few places, but honestly, we have to define what we mean by the ecological. Is it Indigenous peoples at the forefront, autonomously running certain kinds of businesses or opportunities for conservation? Or is there another logic at work there that is very much trying to pretend that it's doing this work of real conservation and real engagement with Indigenous communities? And in fact, it turns out that it's a small place, but it's run by a transnational corporation, and all of that value is going directly back to Nordic countries or Spain or what have you. So my conclusion or my findings are really in the book about the ways in which, again, pointing us to look very specifically and try to understand the models that show us something else that's at work, where wealth can be transferred amongst Indigenous peoples with certain principles around what that kind of transference means. And now I feel like I'm sounding a little bit, purist about this, but to me, given how rapacious global capitalism is, I think the kind of careful work for those of us who are interested in urban settings, how to fend off some of that force. It's not slow violence, as Rob Nixon says. It's rapacious, it's quick, it happens in a year, and same is true in a lot of these rural spaces. And I tell the story of Diane Dunn in the middle of the Sacred Valley in Cusco, how in a couple of years' time, real estate prices have tripled, quadrupled, because once she starts attracting a particular kind of catered market, and pretty soon you have people from the city moving to the country or buying up property around her, and becomes another site for Indigenous territorial dispossession. So I don't think I have all of the answers, certainly, but what I'm trying to do is provide a framework for us to think carefully together and to be able to represent these logics and counter these logics in the ways that I learned from the communities in which I worked around this.
Well, thank you so much for spending some time with us today on Voces Críticas. It was really wonderful to hear more about your work and to share it with a wider audience.
Thank you, Silvana. I really appreciate the thoughtful engagement. Thank you.